people start their talks with thanking their co-investigators, and I certainly want to do that. And when I have to thank my co-investigators, I really have to thank a lot of people. But there's some very interesting, very close co-investigators here. One is my brother, Dr. Cedric Garland, and our colleague, Dr. Edward Gorham, and Sharif Moore, who's a graduate student at UCSD. And another individual that I wanted to point out that's very special to me, as you can see, I'm from the Naval Health Research Center in San Diego, where I'm the technical director. I'm also on the faculty at the UCSD School of Medicine and also at the Moores Cancer Center. But I'm very fortunate today, one of the members of the audience came up to me and said, you know, my father was the first technical director of the Naval Health Research Center, Dr. Walt Wilkins. And she's here today, and she works in diabetes nutrition. So I'm very pleased to have her in the audience, and if she's anything like her father, if I say anything wrong, she'll stand up right away and let me know. So thank you. All right, well, if the mic is working, we'll move on and start talking about whether or not diabetes can be prevented. Now, we're going to focus, as I started to say, on type 1 diabetes, which is juvenile diabetes, which means that it's the diabetes that is most common in children. In fact, the incidence is highest between birth and age 14. The incidence continues on after that, but to a much lesser degree. Now, this is the kind of diabetes, it's also called insulin-dependent diabetes, because the signature sign of it is a disease that responds to treatment with insulin. So if you have a child with insulin with this condition and you give them insulin, the child responds very well. Now, insulin won't cure the disease, and these children live for the rest of their lives under the threat of vascular disease or kidney failure, blindness, and certainly one way or another a shortened lifespan. And in the United States alone, there's approximately 15,000 new cases of type 1 diabetes a year, and about 1.5 million children that are living with the disease right now. Now, as with most of my colleagues in this business, we don't have any relationships to disclose. Now, type 1 diabetes is categorized as an autoimmune disease of unknown etiology. Now, what that means is it's categorized as an autoimmune disease because what's going on is that your body, the immune cells in your body, do not recognize the cells that create insulin in the pancreas, the beta cells, as self, and they attack those cells, and kill them. And it's said to be of unknown etiology because there's no known cause for this disease, no widely recognized cause and no established cause. And because there's no established cause, there are no measures taken anywhere in the world to prevent type 1 diabetes in children. Now, this is the incidence rate of type 1 diabetes in Finland. Sharif Moore made this particular graph, and the points represent the actual incidence points in Finland of type 1 diabetes in children from age 1 to 4, or actually from infancy to age 14. And the line that's plotted is the midpoint between the years. So the line kind of gives you a feeling of the overall flow. Now you might say, why Finland in this particular case? Well, Finland has the highest rates of type 1 diabetes in the world and rates vary widely by location. We'll see a little bit of that later on. But in looking at this graph, let's take a minute and look at it carefully and see what it can tell us. Well, the first thing an epidemiology does usually when they look at a graph or look at a statistic is it an artifact? Is there something that could have caused it that perhaps is not a real event? Well, that's not likely to happen in Finland because in Finland they have nationalized healthcare and they have superb registries. There's not likely to be a change in diagnosis over this time period because this disease is easy to define and easy to get correct as far as a diagnosis. So neither one of those are likely to be in play. So pretty much right off the bat you can lay out an artifact as not being involved. Well, let's take a look at what this graph might tell us about the nature of this disease in Finland. Well, as you can see, starting in 1960, on this graph, somewhere around 1964, they began to plot it and started to keep careful statistics. And there's a general rise from about 16 per 100,000 children to over 65 by 2005. And giving this what we like to call in epidemiology the eyeball test, there's a couple of things that emerge. It looks like there's almost two slopes. It looks like there's one slope that started perhaps in 1965 and goes up to the early 1990s, and then the rate of increase increases. If you can see that yourself. In fact, we're all going to be epidemiologists today because we're going to try to look at this together. But that's something that I think stands out. And as Dr. Gorham pointed out, we're very interested in time, place, and person. And this is a time series. There's 3 tools that epidemiologists use to find out the cause of a disease, and they start with time. So this is a time series, and there's usually information in it that we like to use. So what I'd like to do with this is, as we look at it, we can see that it is, in fact, an epidemic. And an epidemic, to an epidemiologist, is something that has to be halted. And another thing that an epidemic is that it's a public health mystery. And the question that we have facing us is, can we solve this mystery? And I'd like to step through this together and see if we can solve this mystery, and also see if it has the fingerprints of a vitamin D deficiency disease on it. Well, if you're going to solve a mystery, one of the best places to start is at the scene of the crime, or the scene of the mystery in this case. And this is an islet cell that I was talking about. This is the cell in the middle of the, here we go, in the middle here. That's an islet of Langerhans. It's in the pancreas, and some of the cells in there produce insulin, and insulin is required for your body to metabolize and to use glucose properly. This is a healthy cell. Now this is a picture. Ignore these 2 bodies there. Those, I think, are blood vessels, and so they appear clear. But right here is one of those islets of Langerhans, and you'll notice that it's full of black cells. What's happened in this case is that the immune cells of the body, the beta cells, T cells, and macrophages, have gone into the islets of Langerhans and killed and destroyed the beta cells and replaced them utterly. That's why it's called an autoimmune disease. In this particular Langerhans area here, there's still some cells right there that are still pink and are still able to function, but about 60% of it has been wiped out by the person's own immune system. Well, if the triad of epidemiology for solving a disease is time, place, and person, the way that we approach studying of a disease is through another triad, and that's the triad of disease causation. And that includes host, agent, and environment. Now, host factors can be as basic as the basic genetics of the individual and some susceptibility that goes along with that, or something that's been altered in the host. For instance, having a vaccine for a flu, or some other thing that can change a host status in terms of its susceptibility to a particular disease. The next issue is an agent. Most diseases require some sort of an agent, whether it's a virus or a bacteria, or in some cases a chemical that can cause a very serious disease. And lastly, the environment. The environment, and we talk a lot about geophysical factors in our studies of vitamin D. The environment is very important. It can be as small as the room you're in terms of its temperature and humidity for the spread of infectious disease, or as broad as the geophysical factors that we often talk about when we're talking about vitamin D. Well, let's go back and start with the host factors in terms of genetics, the most basic question. Well, here we are back at the mystery that we're looking at and that we're trying to solve. Now, often you'll hear almost for every disease that there's a genetic component, and there may be some sorts of susceptibility. Some individuals with particular HLA types, for instance, are a little bit more susceptible to type 1 diabetes. But is it logical to think that you would have a genetic change in a population like those people living in Finland over this time period that could lead to this much disease? It's really not a logical idea that there would be a genetic change at a basic level that could lead to that kind of an epidemic occurring in a single population. Let's take a look at agent. One of the hypotheses that captured the imagination of the medical community, and one that is still widely held, is that this disease results from an infection from a virus. And one of the viruses that's included in the disease-causing viruses is a picornavirus, a Coxsackie B virus. This is one of the papers. It was an early paper, but it was one that helped set the stage for this theory grabbing hold. This is this is in Norway. Now, the countries where the best epidemiology has been done, and probably the most epidemiology on this disease, happen to be the countries like Finland and Norway and Sweden. Those are also the countries that like to publish these works in a journal called the Journal of Circumpolar Medicine. So you can imagine how focused they are on certain of these issues. Well, that's a clue right there, by the way. In this particular case, there was a coronavirus outbreak in 1983, and these authors showed the relationship over time to the incidence of type 1 diabetes in this population. Well, I must say that as far as I can tell, the disease was actually rising before there was the coronavirus outbreak, and then if anything it went down a little bit or just evened out. So in fact, this is a theory. It's one that's widely held. There's no identified agent for it. You can't find this agent in the Langerhans cells in the area, but nonetheless, from a pathological viewpoint, it might be something good. Something caused a change in those cells, those beta cells that create the insulin, that then the body didn't recognize them anymore. So it could be some kind of an agent, and maybe it's a common virus. Maybe it's a adenovirus or a measles, German measles, or some other thing. But let's say, okay, we'll go with that. You needed some kind of a precipitating agent, and perhaps it's a virus and perhaps it's a common one. Now let's take a look at the top of the triangle, which is environment, and we'll go back and take a quick look at our graph here, and note again that we do seem to have an inflection point somewhere around 1994. Well, the people in Europe, in Northern Europe, got very concerned. And of course they got concerned. I think if you had this sort of a situation going on in a number of your countries, most notably in Finland, but there were other countries in the area, they became very concerned in about 1988 and began a massive study where they enrolled in about 45 different registries in a wide range of countries in Northern Europe. It also happened to include Israel and others, in what they called the EuroDiab study. And it's a major study to look at influences on type 1 diabetes. And it was started in 1988, as we mentioned, and it used 45 registries, and they enrolled about 16,000 children under the age of 15. And they noted, as we just saw in that other graph, that there was a rapid increase in the cases of type 1 diabetes. And this is one of their first analysis. We call this a cohort analysis. It's not a cohort study, but it's a cohort analysis. And these are the different age groups. These are boys in all of these countries. This was published in Lancet in 2000. And what this shows is that the younger children at ages 0 to 4 have a more rapid increase than the older children. Now what you're seeing there is that upturn that we saw around 1994, because the younger children are getting this disease at a more rapid rate. And what it tells you is that while it's going up in the other groups, there was something that happened to those younger children that was more indicative or causing this disease to a greater extent. And the phenomena is in both children that are children, babies, males, and this is the same sort of analysis for females, or maybe I had it the other way around. Yeah, this is girls. All right. Well, when should you, as an epidemiologist, or even as a clinician of any sort, start to suspect that you may be looking at a vitamin D deficiency disease, or possibly even an individual that's vitamin D deficient? Well, as I mentioned, Finland has the Journal of Circumpolar Navigation, and I considered that a pretty good clue right to begin with. But if the disease you're looking at varies by latitude, it's highly likely to be a vitamin D deficiency.